Hello, I'm James, and I'm here to talk to you about these. Specifically this, Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep by Philip K. Dick. If you haven't heard of this book, you might have heard of Blade Runner, a loose adaptation that really doesn't have a huge amount to do with this book, if we're being perfectly honest. If you haven't heard of either, well, here's the lowdown. In the year 1992, a global war leads to the Earth becoming an uninhabitable wasteland. I must have missed that part of my life because the memory of a 2-year-old is spotty at best. Everything has been covered in a radioactive dust, which means most of the population has decided to take up stakes and move to Mars. That is, of course, if they can pass a standardised IQ test, making this a grim vision of the future where the grammar school system has gotten a little bit out of hand. To make up for the fact that you have to go and live out your days on a planet that is basically opposed to human life, every single family that heads for Mars is given a free android helper to make their lives just that little bit easier. Just try not to think about how this is definitely slavery. Occasionally, some of the androids do get a little bit irritated at having to toil away, whilst their human owners presumably become super fat and lazy like in WALL-E, so they run away back to Earth, which is just fine for them really, since the radioactive dust isn't going to bother them any. Unfortunately, mankind, being the jerks that we are, just can't let this live and let live. So bounty hunters exist for the sole purpose of hunting down and killing rogue androids before the other people that decided to stick around on Earth get a wind of it. That's where our hero Rick Deckard comes in. Rick Deckard is the second potato bounty hunter in San Francisco and is given the job of tracking down 6 escaped Nexus 6 androids after the head honcho bounty hunter got shot by one of them. What follows is a brilliantly told exploration of the ethics of profiling, social othering, elitism, and hypocrisy that is every bit as relevant today as it was when it was written. Now I'm sad. Let's talk about profiling. As a law enforcement tool, profiling is used to build a picture of a likely suspect of a crime by assigning certain elements of a crime to a certain type of person. Sounds all well and good, but that's only if it can be done reasonably. Profiling is a controversial subject because it often isn't done reasonably. People can be profiled based not necessarily on their actions, but rather by their social class, their religion, or even their race. It's a dangerous road to walk and can lead to all sorts of problems, including police harassment, racially motivated fear and paranoia, and undue suspicion based on nothing other than somebody fitting the type. In Androids, Philip K. Dick has created a world where profiling has been given a new face, and that face is the android. If we ignore the fact that fleeing Mars in this universe is a crime in itself, and the androids Deckard is hunting actually did kill a few humans, we see that the entire police department is basically ready just to jump to the conclusion that androids on Earth are up to no good simply because of the fact that they're androids. This view comes to a head when Deckard temporarily teams up with somebody named Phil Resch. He's another bounty hunter from a different department, and it's a whole long story that I don't really need to go into. The point is, unlike Deckard, Resch is violently opposed to the existence of androids, believing himself justified in acting to kill, even without knowing for 100% certain that his target was even an android or not. The suspicion alone justified in Resch's mind his actions. Not being a complete psychotic, Deckard doesn't actually take this too well, chewing Resch out for his unjustifiable violence. It's an interesting moment in the novel. Deckard, a man who has spent his entire life in a calculated pursuit of androids, is upset that Resch has killed one. By the point in the novel that this happens, the suspect is all but confirmed to be an android, but it's that little niggle of doubt, the small margin of error that Deckard has. It's asking the audience, what if? Is it right for us to target a group of people in order to preemptively make ourselves safer? Or is it too risky? And that margin of error for hitting one of the good guys, is it too great to be justifiable? This is a key question that Dick asks throughout the book. In an earlier scene, Deckard performs the Voight-Kampff empathy test on Rachel Rosen, a young woman presented to him as the niece of Eldon Rosen, the man in charge of the corporation that invented the androids. The Voight-Kampff test is the tool that bounty hunters use to identify an android, because unlike human beings, androids don't feel empathy in the same way. At the conclusion of the test, Deckard identifies Rachel as an android, but is told by Eldon Rosen that he's been mistaken. Rosen says that Rachel has an undeveloped sense of empathy due to living in isolation on a starship during her formative years. This is the first point that Deckard is faced with the possibility that his methods are actually flawed. As Rachel herself says, if I was caught in a police dragnet, I would have been killed. And she's absolutely correct. Were this done as part of an investigation, Deckard would likely have killed Rachel. As it is, he's forced to admit that his test is flawed. Or he would be if Rachel really wasn't an android. Much like the incident with Resh, events play out so that Deckard's methods seem to work just fine for now, but that element of doubt is still planted in his mind. It's the seeds of a what if. So why is this only coming up now then? Deckard is a career bounty hunter after all. This isn't his first time that he's hunted down a few androids, so why hasn't he thought about all of this before? It could be as simple as because it's a novel and we need a character arc, but it's probably more involved than that. In the world Dick's created, the only thing running more rampant than the androids is social othering. Othering is a term used to describe the act of casting someone or something as other, that being separate to the self. In simple terms, it's about setting up an us versus them system, where us is the good guys and them the bad. In a social context, when somebody is made into other, they are cast out from society and essentially stripped of their rights to engage with that society, forced to live on the fringe. This is dangerous for what should be obvious reasons. It's a complex topic to go into in huge detail right now, but the extreme results of this kind of thing could lead to social isolation, radicalization, and dehumanization. So how does all this happen then? To create them, we, as us, need to believe that them and us are intrinsically different, so that the idea of one of us being anything like one of them is unthinkable to us. This process can often start in a fairly innocuous way by giving them a nickname. Androids, in this example, are known by the majority of population as Andes, and people of lower intellect affected by the radioactive dust in some way covering everything are called chickenheads or specials. It might not sound like that big a deal on the surface, but soon that label starts to become justification for all sorts of regrettable behaviour. J.R. Isidore is a character introduced fairly early into the novel, and he is technically a chickenhead, even though he didn't fail the IQ test by a huge margin. As a result, he's been forced to work in a shitty job where his boss mistreats him, is made fun of his intellect and social weaknesses to the point of abuse. And that's just a fellow human. Androids arguably have it a lot worse. They are, for all intents and purposes, just like humans. They think, they have emotions to an extent, but they are machines and are treated as such, justified by their one glaring difference, their inability to process empathy. Empathy is made a big deal of in the world that Dick's created. Being empathetic is the mark of a good person, so says the cult-like religion of Mercerism, and it should be encouraged. And encouraged it is. Since the war killed off the majority of the population of animals on Earth, it's now seen as a great show of empathy to take care of an animal, as it is believed that doing so successfully requires compassion for something other than yourself. Owning and caring for an animal is actually Deckard's largest motivating factor in the novel, as his pet sheep had previously gotten sick and died, and he is now caring for a robotic replica, a source of great shame for him. But why? Is being seen as empathetic really that big a deal? Well, yes, it is. But it's not about the empathy, not really. It's about belonging. Deckard isn't driven to care for an animal because he has empathy for the creatures. Arguably nobody really does. It's all about keeping up the appearance of belonging to us. Several times in the novel, Deckard is offered the chance to buy a small animal well within his budget, but he is put off doing so because it wouldn't be as good as the sheep that he previously had, and certainly not as good as the horses that his neighbour owns. That's right, Deckard, our hero, is a complete hypocrite. Happy to judge those that are different whilst desperately pretending to belong, and hypocrisy doesn't stop there. Duplicity and hypocrisy are central themes in the book. Aside from Deckard himself keeping up the appearances, there's also the cult-like religion of Mercerism, revealed ultimately to be a sham to try and give people a sense of belonging, and Rachel Rosen, who seduces Deckard into a relationship only to try and warn him off going after her fellow androids. But the biggest hypocrisy probably comes from the androids themselves. For most of the novel, they seem rather justified in their actions, hiding out and minding their own business, and how can you really judge them for that? I mean, they were slaves, for God's sake. It is easy to think that way, until they ruin the life of poor J.R. Isidore. Isidore comes across Pris, one of the androids, using another room in the abandoned hotel that he's staying in. It doesn't take long before Pris and two other androids start to treat Isidore as little more than a slave himself, having him haul their belongings around and taking advantage of his low intellect and gentle nature. It's no accident that Isidore is the only one who is genuinely honest about who he is the entire time, though sadly that does make him the story's biggest tragedy. Ultimately, Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep is a story about society divided. It's a tale of what happens when we hold ourselves as separate from others and use those differences to justify treating the others as in some way inferior to ourselves. It highlights dangerous trends in our own society and the tragic extremes that these behaviours can ultimately lead to. What Dick does, quite brilliantly, is highlight these things and ask us to question them. It's right there in the title. Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep? We are asked right from the outset to consider if those that we see as different really are that different from us at all. I've rambled on and on for a good while now, so thank you for sticking with me. If you like this video and want to see more, then click the subscribe button. If you want to discuss the things I've touched on in this video and just want to tell me I'm full of hot air, then go ahead and leave a comment. That's what they're there for. Until next time, go read a book or something.